It is 1962, a Tuesday morning in early October. The air smells faintly of coffee and pressed cotton. A woman stands at her vanity, not hurrying, not rushing, moving through a sequence she has performed 1,000 times. She pins her hair, she smooths her skirt, she draws on her gloves, white ones, pristine, before she touches the door handle. She is not going somewhere special. She is going to the grocery store. But there is a way to do this. There has always been a way. And she knows every single step. What you're about to hear are not rules that were written down anywhere. They were never published in a book or printed in a pamphlet. They were passed from mother to daughter in quiet kitchens, communicated through a lifted eyebrow or a gentle correction. Not like that, dear. Like this. Most people today have no idea these codes even existed, and yet, for an entire generation of women, they were as real and as present as the air itself. Some of them were limiting, some of them were quietly brilliant, and some, perhaps more than we'd like to admit, worked better than anything we've replaced them with. This is the world they lived in. Let's step back inside it. In the mid-century world, a woman's reputation was one of the few things she could fully own. Not her property, in many cases, not always her career, but her character, the way she was spoken of by others, the impression she left, the trust she had built up across years of small, consistent choices. That was hers entirely. And so it was protected, not with calculation or performance, but with consistency. With the understanding that people are always, quietly, paying attention. That how you behave when nothing important seems to be happening is precisely what defines you. A woman's word meant something. Her punctuality meant something. Whether she was kind to the woman who cleaned her church meant something. Not because the world was watching, but because she was. This was perhaps the deepest unspoken rule of all. You are always in the process of becoming the person others will one day describe. Choose accordingly. This rule was never stated outright. It was simply demonstrated again and again until it became instinct. If you visited someone's home, you straightened the cushion before you rose from the sofa. You carried your cup to the sink without being asked. If you noticed a glass left on the table, you took it with you on your way past. You did not make extra work for the woman of the house. And in your own home, the rooms were kept in a certain order, not for appearances, but for peace. A tidy room was a room where the mind could rest, where you weren't confronted every time you walked in with evidence of things left undone. This was the belief, and it was not wrong. Psychologists have studied it at length now. We have given it new names, but the women of the 1950s and 60s knew it in their bones. The state of a room affects the state of a person. Because they did. A letter in 1960 was not dashed off. It was composed. You sat down at a desk, or at the kitchen table, if that was what you had, and you thought about what you wanted to say. You might write a draft first, crossing things out lightly. You chose your words with care, because once they were on the page and sealed in the envelope, they were permanent. The letters women wrote in those years were extraordinary things, full of detail, full of feeling, carefully worded. Descriptions of the weather, the children, the new neighbor down the street. But underneath all of it, a genuine effort to reach through the paper and make the reader feel present. Many of those letters were saved, were read again years later, were pressed between the pages of journals, because they were worth keeping. We have sent approximately nothing worth keeping in 20 years. The price of your dress, your furniture, your vacation, none of it was discussed. Asking what someone paid for something was considered extraordinarily rude. Volunteering the information was considered something close to boasting. Money was, at its core, a private matter. You might be managing carefully, cutting the housekeeping budget by a few dollars here and there, remaking last year's dress into something new. But no one outside your home needed to know. There was a quiet pride in this, in the woman who could make a $5 roast look like a celebration, in the one who refashioned a coat so skillfully that no one could tell it had been done. The craft of making do was kept private, and that privacy made it something closer to artistry. It did not matter if you were religious or not. Sunday was different. Shops were closed, the telephone was used sparingly. There was no agenda for the day, only the loose, unhurried structure of the family doing things together. The smell of a Sunday in 1955 was specific. Roast meat, furniture polish, newspapers left open on the sofa. Church for some, long drives for others, quiet reading in the afternoon. But always, always a slowing down. A collective agreement that this one day would not be consumed by productivity. Women observed this rule perhaps more fully than anyone. Sunday was the day the house rested. Laundry was not done, errands were not run. The week's anxieties were set aside by common, unspoken consent. We have lost Sunday almost entirely, and the loss is larger than it sounds. We replaced a day of genuine rest with a day of catching up, and we call that an improvement. It may be the most expensive trade we ever made without realizing we were making it. You did not dominate. You did not interrupt. You did not turn the subject back to yourself too quickly. These were considered fundamental courtesies of conversation, not skills to be learned, but basic decencies already understood. A woman was expected to be a generous listener, to ask a follow-up question before offering her own experience, to allow a silence to settle rather than rushing to fill it. Silences were not uncomfortable in the same way they are now. They were simply pauses, breathing room, space where the other person might still be thinking. In the dining rooms of the 1960s, a conversation could stay on a single subject for 20 minutes, going deeper, finding nuance, actually arriving somewhere. No one was half watching a screen. No one was composing their next remark while the other person was still speaking. We talk more now, we say less. If you were the one who had invited people into your home, you were the last to rest, the last to eat, the last to exhale. This was not a burden, it was an honor. The table would be laid before the guests arrived. The food would be kept warm and ready. When everyone was seated, the hostess moved between the kitchen and the dining room with quiet efficiency, refilling glasses before they were empty, replacing dishes before they were missed. She ate standing in the kitchen sometimes, a quiet bite between courses, alone for 30 seconds in the warm room that smelled of everything she had cooked. There was no resentment in it, ideally, only a deep satisfaction in having provided, in having made a room full of people feel cared for. That feeling, the women of that era understood, was its own kind of nourishment. This rule had its painful limitations, certainly, but it also contained a philosophy that deserves a second look. A woman in 1958 did not cry at the office. She did not share her anxiety with her neighbors over the fence. She did not, as a rule, discuss her marital difficulties with anyone but her closest friend, and even then, carefully. Not because her feelings were wrong, but because the public expression of private suffering was considered a kind of trespass. She would come home. She might sit in the kitchen for a few minutes with a cup of tea. She would collect herself, and then she would go back to the people who needed her. There was a resilience in this that we sometimes mistake for repression. Sometimes it was, but sometimes it was simply the understanding that not every feeling needs an audience, that composure is its own form of strength. The grocery run was not an occasion for yesterday's clothes. That is perhaps the rule that would most shock a modern observer. A woman leaving her home, for any reason, was expected to be presentably dressed. This did not require expense. A clean house dress, properly pressed, hair combed and pinned, shoes that matched, a light coat in the cooler months. The standard was not elegance, it was care. The reasoning behind it was straightforward. You might encounter anyone, a neighbor, your child's teacher, your husband's colleague. You were not just representing yourself, you were representing your household. And the household, in that world, was something worth representing. There is something to be said for it. The act of dressing with intention, even for small things, changes how you move through the world. It always did.
Sit with your back away from the chair. Cross your ankles, not your knees. When you rise, move smoothly. No pushing up from the armrests if you can help it. Hold yourself as though a thread runs from the crown of your head straight up through the ceiling. These were not vanity instructions. They were daily exercises in self-awareness. Young women in the 1950s were still sometimes taught to walk with a book balanced on their heads, not as a performance, but as a lesson in how the body moves when it is paying attention. Posture was considered a form of respect for the room, for the people in it, and for yourself. Physiotherapists today will tell you that posture matters enormously, that the way we carry our bodies affects our breathing, our confidence, our long-term health. The women of the mid-century knew this. They just didn't call it wellness. They called it bearing, and they considered it non-negotiable. Within 24 hours, that was the rule. If someone had you to dinner, you wrote a note. If you received a gift, you wrote a note. If a friend helped you through something difficult, a note. Not an email, not a phone call. A handwritten card, sealed in an envelope, sent through the post. The notes were short, a few lines, sincerely meant. They smelled faintly of the drawer where the stationery was kept, lavender sometimes, or cedar. The writing itself took 5 minutes. The mailing took a stamp. And yet the woman who received it would keep it, would read it again, would feel, perhaps for days, that she had been truly seen. We have faster ways of saying thank you now, but we rarely make anyone feel that way anymore. This one was unspoken, but universally understood. A woman dining alone was perfectly acceptable, but she did not linger. She did not take a corner booth and spread out her things. She ate with purpose. She was somewhere, not nowhere. The lunch counters of the 1950s and 60s were quick, bright, slightly noisy places. The smell of coffee and warm pie in the air, the soft clatter of cups being set down. A woman on her own would order, eat neatly, and leave at a reasonable pace. Not rushed, but not permanent. There was something in this that spoke to a larger awareness of not making yourself a burden to a space, of being present without sprawling, a courtesy to the room, a discipline toward oneself. Before text messages, before emails, before the casual drop of a notification into someone's morning, there was the calling card. A small, cream-colored rectangle, your name engraved in the center. Sometimes a simple flourish, nothing more. When you visited someone's home and they were not in, you left your card on the silver tray in the entryway. If you were paying a condolence call, you turned down the upper right corner. If you were calling in person, you turned the left. Each fold carried meaning. Each placement said something. It sounds fussy, elaborate, but consider what it represented. The understanding that your presence, even your attempted presence, deserved to be documented. That the gesture of showing up mattered, even when it went unseen. We have forgotten the calling card entirely, and something subtle and gracious went with it. The telephone rule, possibly the most rigidly observed social law of the mid-century, and certainly the one that caused the most quiet suffering. A woman did not call a man, not to confirm plans, not to check in, not even to say goodnight. She waited. The phone would sit on its little table in the hallway, heavy, black, utterly silent, and she would find other things to do. Fold the laundry, read a chapter, water the plants a second time. Because the waiting was part of it. The waiting was the rule. Was it fair? Probably not. But the women who kept that rule also understood something about patience and self-possession that has largely been lost in an era when we respond to everything within seconds. There was a dignity in the waiting, even if no one asked for it.
It sounds almost impossible now, but there was a time, not so long ago, when a woman simply did not leave the house without her gloves. Not for church, not for a luncheon, and certainly not for the grocery store or the bank. Gloves were not merely fashion. They were a signal, a quiet, unspoken message that said, I have prepared myself. I take this seriously. I respect you enough to be presentable. White cotton for daytime, longer gloves for evenings. The texture was cool and smooth, slightly stiff at first, softening through the morning. Women kept multiple pairs, one always drying, one always ready. It cost almost nothing, and yet it carried everything. The rule is gone now, but the feeling it created, of composure, of readiness, that feeling is something we spend a great deal of money trying to recreate.
These rules are mostly gone now. Some of them gratefully so. Some of them were too rigid, too confining, too bound up in a world that had not yet made room for all of what women could be. But others were small and luminous things, ways of moving through a day with care, ways of showing up for people, ways of holding yourself with dignity, not for anyone else, but because it felt like the right way to carry a life. There is something that happens when we lose a ritual, even a quiet one. The space it occupied doesn't disappear. It just fills with noise, with speed, with the constant low-grade anxiety of a life that has no pauses built into it. The women who lived by these codes are older now. Some of them are gone. But spend an afternoon with one who remains, and you will notice something. A particular stillness, a way of listening that makes you feel, for a few minutes, like the most important person in the room. That didn't happen by accident. It was practiced, for years, in ways that most people today never saw and never knew. And now, you do.
If this brought back a memory, or gave you something new to think about, there's another video waiting for you that I think you'll love just as much. It's about the beauty rituals women used to keep from the 1950s through the 1970s. Most of them made from things found in an ordinary kitchen. Simple, inexpensive, and surprisingly effective. It's right here when you're ready.